I am delighted to introduce Dr. Newby-Clark and Grace Colp from the University of Guelph. Ian is a past president of the Society for Descriptive Psychology. Ian and Grace are passionate about descriptive psychology and increasing its influence in academic psychology. With their eyes on that goal, they will place descriptive psychology in a broader context with respect to the levels of analysis in psychology, problems in how academics work at those levels, and points of contact between descriptive psychology and other person-oriented psychologies. Grace received her BA from the University of Guelph, where Ian works as a professor of psychology, and just completed a term as the chair of the department. They continue to collaborate on descriptive psychology projects. In her spare time, Grace loves to hike, snowboard in the mountains of British Columbia, and Ian enjoys flying around southern Ontario in a plane without an engine. Please join me in welcoming Ian and Grace discussing person-oriented psychologies, opportunities for integration and collaboration.
Thank you very much, James. And so sorry, everybody, for the technical glitches. Grace and I thought we had this really elegant solution where we were going to place her in that nice blue box there that says Grace, but that hasn't worked out. But we're just gonna soldier on. So yes, today, as Jean mentioned, we're going to be talking to you about a few other person-oriented psychologists out there, to let you know that we're all not alone. There aren't a lot of other person-oriented psychologies out there, and which is kind of unfortunate. And we're going to lead you through some of our thoughts about where person-oriented psychology figures in the bigger picture, some of the mistakes that so-called mainstream psychologists make when they think that they're doing person-oriented psychology, and hopefully lots of time for discussion and questions and for your input about your insights about person-oriented psychology as well. And with that, I'll throw to Grace, who you can't see, but she's there, right?
Yes, hello everyone. I do just want to say thank you very much for all of the technical support and accommodating me not being able to be there. My apologies, but I am there in spirit and on Zoom, so hello everyone. Just a little overview. Ian kind of touched on our subjects here today, but really go through how we will be presenting this. We're going to discuss the three branches within psychology, which I'll expand on in a moment. It is essentially a proposed system for classifying within psychology. We will then touch on the case for person-oriented psychology, and this includes some potential weaknesses in the current field of psychological research and how we can better adapt those. And then we will also use Smith, Kubovy, and Smedslund as points to support our integration for different types of person-oriented psychologies. Finally, we will conclude with points of contact with descriptive psychology, just kind of round it up and see how we see the integration really coming to life here.
Oh.
All right, so the three branches that I did discuss here previously. This is a taxonomy of psychology written by Lundh in 2023, so it is quite recent actually. He bases this off of a system that is used in genetics. And so this type of system that's used to classify different types of genetics includes three different branches, and that is classical, population, and molecular. And that was a system developed that Lundh had adopted into psychology. And what he did was take these three branches and essentially apply them to psychology and separating person psychology, population psychology, and mechanism psychology. And so these are pretty self-explanatory for most of us, but just an example of person psychology would be tracking an individual over time. An example of population psychology would be any psychological demographic work, such as favorability ratings for presidential candidates. And then an example of mechanism psychology is going to be work that focuses on neuropsychological processes as well as information processing. So it kind of helps explain these three categories, these three branches that he has developed here. And so the idea behind separating these type of psychologies into this system is to be able to better match research questions to their methods, as each branch quite obviously requires a different approach to the research methods being used because they have very different questions being asked at each level. Research being done at the population level should be clearly identified as so and separated from research being done at the person and mechanism level. Sometimes when things seem the most obvious, we still need identification and structure just to ensure consistency across the field. And that's essentially what this three branches system is looking at here. So a system can better help us match these research questions with their research methods. Yeah.
Okay, that's me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so. Let me expand a little bit on what Grace just very nicely outlined with respect to the three branches of psychology. If you're a consumer of psychological literature, one thing that you'll notice is that a lot of the time, studies are being conducted, data are being collected and analyzed, and results are being reported at the sample level with inference to the population. But unfortunately, there's often a bit of a slide into talking about how people behave, and often then sliding further into talking about an individual person and how a person thinks or behaves. And so what we're seeing here is a move from the population level into the level of person. And there's a real problem associated with doing that. It is well recognized in critical psychology and theoretical psychology, though it continues. And it's called the assumption of homogeneity, that what's been happening overall in your sample is something that's happening within all or most of the people in your sample. And that is not necessarily the case. In fact, there are only that only holds under certain conditions, and the research tends to suggest that those conditions often don't hold. So kind of a classic example, somebody does some sort of psychotherapeutic intervention, and you see no overall effect in the sample. You see no change in depression levels in the sample from time one to time two, and then people conclude, well, there's nothing going on here. But what could in fact be happening is that half the folks could be getting better and half the folks could be getting worse, right? There are other examples. For example, if you observe a correlation of some magnitude between, for example, self-esteem and depression of some magnitude, you could come to assume that for every person in that sample, as depression wanes, self-esteem goes up, but there's all sorts of possibilities for exactly what's happening there. Third variables, different directions, reciprocities, and it could be some combination of those as well for each person, and you'd never be able to tell. But nonetheless, people often cross levels in psychological research like this. And then with respect to moving and this is something that Joe's already touched on, with respect to moving from the level of mechanism to person, well, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but what tends to happen with in studies of various mechanisms is homunculi are often posited, right? So, for example, there was some early work in the study of perception that kind of slipped into talking about how the retina sees things, but that's impossible, right? Because then you have to come up with a way for the retina to be able to see it, and you start to have an infinite regress. Baddeley, in his classic work on cognitive psychology, posited as one of the main systems in cognition, an executive system, and he admitted that he's displacing a homunculus there that then you'd have to then go on to explain. And then there was a very early theory of perception called pandemonium, which I think was kind of a joke in a way, in which there were thousands and thousands of homunculi who were saying yes, no, when something came in to come up, right?
Crowdsourcing.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, right. So, and of course, that's a problem as well. And so what Lundh is doing here in this piece is saying, okay, one really good way of thinking about psychological research, the stuff that, psychology does on a regular basis is you have these three different levels, and let's keep the levels distinct from each other, because otherwise you have these very problematic fallacies, thinking errors creeping in. And Grace has already mentioned the importance of matching question and method. So if you want to know, if you want to know what people think of the two presidential candidates right now, overall, to predict overall voting patterns, then that's what you do. If you want to track how people's voting preferences change over time, maybe you want to look at particular people and how they change over time, right? Or what have you. And then there's a problem here. So we really do need a person-oriented psychology, because people seem to be slipping around in terms of using data at one level to make inferences about what's happening at another level. But the other problem is we don't really have a lot of person-oriented psychologies right now. We're going to highlight a couple. I think maybe some of you will have some other examples of person-oriented psychologies. The ones we're going to talk about today, we think, have very nice connections with descriptive in various ways. We have our thoughts on that, but we're also going to invite other people's thoughts. Grace, anything to add there?
We covered it all. It was pretty good.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I practiced. Unusual for me. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about a fellow named Christian Smith. And his work in the idea of personhood. Christian Smith actually gets mentioned in the same breath same sentence by Lundh as Ossorio. And I think there are some very deep similarities here. Smith is a sociologist, but he makes a lot of really interesting points that I think have contact with some of the philosophical underpinnings of descriptive. So in some cases redundant, in some cases maybe giving us a little bit more, but I'm interested in your thoughts on this. And one of the things that, so Lund's talking about levels of analysis, but then that immediately raises the question, how do these levels relate to each other, right? That's one of the things that we need to consider, because obviously they do. And Smith makes a really interesting point that as opposed to common scientific narratives about how the world works, the phenomenon of emergence, which I'm going to go into a little bit of detail now about, as opposed to it being some sort of uncommon or rare event, is actually an extremely common event in the world. It's something that we need to understand happens all the time, and gives us a really good way of thinking about how levels relate to each other. So what's emergence? So a couple of examples of emergence. Birds in flight, right? Have you ever seen patterns of birds in flight? Individual birds go about flying, but because of the way they relate to each other, and this is the important word, because of the way they relate to each other in the air, they form certain very predictable patterns, right? You ever seen where I live, there are those little birds, and there are thousands upon thousands of them, and then they form those sweeping patterns, right? That's an emergent property of the group. There's nothing about a particular bird that makes that pattern happen. It's because there's a certain relation occurring. Another example is water. Water has the quality of wetness, indisputable, but there's nothing about the molecular structure of water, right, that would tell you about wetness, right? So wetness is an emergent property of a lower, quote unquote, lower level. And there are many other examples. The computer that I have here consists of all sorts of different pieces of metal and what's in this, Joe? Metal, transistors, exotic metals. Oh, so yeah, but they're configured in a certain pattern to relate to each other in a particular way that gives an emergent property of it being a computer, being able to do math and remind me of what I'm going to say and all those kinds of good things. And so we can also think about this at the more social level, where certain facts about the world, like people's economic preferences, their noticing of skin colors, their preferences for where they live, etc., combining into segregation, for example. This is an example that Smith uses. And so segregation is an emergent property of a lot of different kinds of social forces, for the lack of a better word, coming together. But there's an interesting feature there. You have an emergent property now of segregation, but then it actually can have force in the world to make other things happen, right? As well. So so just like a computer can make things happen. So emergence is a integral part of the way we should think about the way the world works, and our in the psychological, we act as persons. Enough said about that. And this is to combat what Smith, and this is something that Joe talked about as well. This is to combat what Smith calls nothing buttery, right? So people are nothing but brains, right? And of course, then brains are nothing but et cetera, right? And that's a fundamental error, because you're ignoring the fact of emergence, and that there are phenomena at one level that are not reducible to phenomena at another level in an ontological sense. Okay. So that's emergence. Any questions about that? Move on. We're good? Okay. Then critical realism. So Smith is a critical realist, and I'm going to kind of uncharacteristically read something about this because it's kind of complicated. And I'm going to be really interested in people's thoughts about how this does or does not have, how it does or does not line up with Ossorio in descriptive psychology, because I have some thoughts about that, but I'm not entirely clear. Critical realism's central organizing thought is that much of reality exists independently of human consciousness of it, that reality itself is complex, open, and stratified in multiple dimensions or levels, right? So we're going back to levels and the fact of emergence, some of which come to exist through the crucial process of emergence, that humans can acquire a truthful, though fallible knowledge and understanding of reality through various forms of discipline, conceptualization, inquiry, and theoretical reflection. This sounds pretty close to descriptive psychology to me. There might be some points to quibble on there, but so that's Smith's philosophical underpinning that's driving a lot of his work here. And then he is also, and I'm not sure exactly, Joe, how this relates to personism, but Smith is a personalist. So I don't know if that's just a different word to describe the same thing. He says it's a broad school of thought. It's not a particular, it's not like descriptive, but personalism claims more for and about humans than the model of humans as fundamentally rational, self-interested, exchange-making calculators of costs and benefits. So he defines, and this is related to his definition of person, and this is more expansive than Ossorio's, but it has a lot of contact with it, I think. A person is a conscious, reflexive, embodied, self-transcending center of subject experience, durable identity, and moral commitment, and social communication who exercises complex capacities for agency and intersubjectivity in order to sustain his or her own incommunicable self in loving relationships with other personal selves and with the non-personal world. So it's a bit bigger, right, than Ossorio did, but there's a lot of commonality there, and so I think we might have found a nice close cousin. One of the things that Smith does is explicitly brings in a moral component that I think is implicit in Ossorio's work, but it's not center stage as Smith sets it up for it. So that's Smith. So I read his whole book called "What is a Person?" Good title, and it's certainly quite fascinating, and I think has a lot to help us think about persons and personhood. And with that, I'm gonna throw it to Grace.
All right, so we're gonna move on to, and mind my pronunciation, but I'm pretty sure it's Kubovy, so I will be pronouncing it that way. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Right now, what we're gonna be focusing on is one of his papers written in 2015, The Deep Structures of Lives. And so in this paper, he talks about this unidimensional flow of time, streams of behavior looked at flat versus multiple strands, and how this deep structure requires a proper taxonomy to be able to fully implement it and use it. And so in this paper, Kubovy introduces us to multiple strands within our lives. And what this is it's a contrasting the idea that we typically view and discuss life as flat, one-dimensional, starting at A, ending at Z in one continuous line. And the reality is, and what Kubovy introduced us to, is that we live in this unidimensional flow of time where we have multiple strands of behavior happening at once. Think of it as multiple lines of this A to Z twisted together. And so they are all continuous in this unidimensional flow of time. And so what I really like about Kubovy's work is that it addresses the complexities of person-oriented psychology and that branch of person psychology. And it kind of emphasizes the necessity of, as I said, a proper taxonomy within person-oriented psychology to use this deep structure. So I will continue with this multiple strands idea in the next slide here, kind of with an example, which we will go on to.
Oh, right, yeah. Sorry.
That one is kind of just a quick introduction, but we go a little bit deeper here. And so he continues with his work in 2020 with his work on strands. And so he gives this great example of mother and attorney example. And so what it is it's the idea of this woman who has a child and as well works in law as an attorney. And when she goes to work in the morning, she does not suddenly become childless the minute that she enters that law firm. And when she leaves work and goes home, she does not become jobless. Both of these realities are existing at the same time. One is in the foreground, however, it is active, it is present, and it is affecting her perception of the world at all times. These are each individual strands that are happening, so these A to Z strands. More examples of this is that she plays tennis on Thursdays at the country club. She goes to Anglican church on Sundays, and once a month she volunteers at the soup kitchen. So these are kind of small aspects of someone's life, but they are strands in themselves. It goes to show how many strands we can have in one's life working all in the same time in this unidimensional flow of time. These strands are made up of role, caste, setting, norms, values, habits, routines, all these good things you can think of that make up our person. We can actually separate them into strands and kind of isolate them. And so what this is kind of introducing to us is what I just mentioned. We are able, when discussing persons, to separate each of these things in their lives, but strands makes it a little bit more tangible, provides a sense of structure to evaluate all of the different parts in a person's. And so in this paper, he does go on to provide some types of proof of how this is possible in our brain and how that these multiple strands is the reality of our perception. So he uses auditory stream segregation as well as threaded cognition to kind of provide proof of these multiple strands. And I'm sure some of you have touched on these things, but auditory stream segregation, a good example of that is when we're listening to an orchestra, we are able to isolate each of the instruments to hear them, but at the same time, we're also able to hear the symphony happening. So it's kind of showing how in our perception, we are able to have multiple it's a different version of strands, but multiple things happening at the same time, and they're existing in this unidimensional flow of time. Threaded cognition, I'm not going to do it justice enough, but just to lightly touch on it. The idea that we're able to start tasks at different times, but have it culminating and finishing at the same time. So again, different strands starting at different times and areas, but overall it is in one unidimensional flow of time again. And then I do bring up here confusion of experience with memory, and I didn't want to touch a whole lot on this, but I do feel like it's worth bringing to attention if I am going to use Kubovy's work, as he does make a pretty important case on this, and the difference between the experiencing self versus the remembering self, and how this affects person-oriented psychology when we look at a person. And so, as most of you know, I'm assuming, when someone recalls an event, they are recalling the last memory they have of the event, not the event itself as it happened to the experiencing person. And that is just, we could go on a whole other tangent with that, but it's another really good point to look at when discussing person-oriented psychology, and we're really looking at that person psychology branch. And so this just plays a key factor when discussing PO psychology and how we approach research methods to that. But the main point of this one is going to be strands and that proof of how we are able to have multiple strands in our reality in this unidimensional flow of time. And that's that.
Okay, thanks, Grace. I also want to just briefly touch on Smedslund, because you either briefly touch on Smedslund or you do an hour talk on Smedslund. And I'm not the guy to do that. That would be Martin who would be doing that. Because you're in that book, right? Respect for Thought? Yeah.
And also married.
What's that?
Mary Roberts.
Oh, Mary
is also
Roberts
in
is
that book.
also, yeah, Mary Roberts is also in it, which is how I got to know about Smedslund. So Smedslund, is also, has also been doing work for, what, 6 decades on, probably, right?
Yeah.
At least in psychology, and he's definitely been at the person level. He's a person-oriented psychological researcher. I had the good fortune in 2019 of going to the International Society for Theoretical Psychology, where Martin was as well, for a festschrift for Smedslund, which resulted in this book. Respect for Thought, and Martin has a chapter in it, and our own Mary Kay Roberts also has a chapter in it as well. Smedslund has many accomplishments in terms of his work. One of the major ones I would argue is his work on what he calls psychologic. It has very much the same kind of character as descriptive psychology, actually. Although it's actually kind of more mathematical than what we do. The metaphor there actually is Euclidean geometry, really. Smedslund's book of Psychologic is, what just happened there? Okay, who knows? Is full of axioms and corollaries that talk about how persons behave in the world, and it's extensive and quite complex. It's almost like some sort of predicate calculus in a way. Like it's quite sophisticated, but I think, you know, he's very much a kindred spirit with respect to person-oriented psychology. One of the interesting things about Smedslund is that he says that there are in fact no empirical questions in psychology, which I thought was kind of a provocative claim. And I don't think that we necessarily agree with that, but I think there's a lot to get out of him, and I encourage you to look into his work. Straight back chair, cold room, and a good urn of coffee nearby, if you're going to be looking at psychological history. It's heady stuff, but fun. But fun, and I think you'll find an affinity because of the fact that you're a descriptive psychologist. Okay, so some of the points of contact that Grace and I see with descriptive, and Grace, you want to do these first, and I'll do them, or?
Yeah, sure. So first one, personhood as an important and legitimate level of analysis. Actually, you know what, Ian? I do feel like that you should start off with that one.
Okay, sure. Sure. Well, the first one I think is kind of obvious to us and obvious to all the other folks who are doing person level, person oriented psychological work. And I think that one of the tasks for people who do research at the person level and theorizing about psychology at the person level is arguing it for it being a legitimate level of analysis. Really, I think that's been like a lot of the academic work that we've needed to do is to argue against the Patricia Churchlands of the world, the limited materialists, the reductionists, that there is a way of being precise, and when you're talking about persons, there might be an alignment with everyday language and folk notions of persons, but that's not what we're doing exactly in our work. Do you want me to do all of them, Grace?
I didn't want to interrupt you. I wanted to make sure. Continue it on with the everyday language used precisely. I think that a really good point kind of we've brought to attention here is it's a little bit redundant, but the complexity of person-oriented psychology, the the vast avenues that you can go down within this. It isn't just to say, oh, within psychology, person-oriented psychology is one subdivision. Within that, it is so complex, and there are deep structures within it that we do require this precise language, these proper structures and taxonomy to be able to have consistency across the board as well, because it is still finding its way, I find, for person-oriented psychology within all of psychology. This use of precise language would really help to kind of create those foundations across the board.
And the people that we've been talking about today, they are all very interested in using language in a very precise way. Smith goes to a lot of links to give his definition of what a person is. Kubovy, Grace could say more about this than I could, but obviously is being very specific when he's talking about Jan Smedslund, very precise. His Psychologic is filled with very precise definitions and relations amongst those definitions. Obviously, we also highly value the precise use of language, which is something that we would, I think most of us would agree, the rest of the discipline doesn't tend to take too much notice of. And as Grace talked about, embracing the complexity of the behavior of persons, if you think to Ossorio's auxiliary statements for frustration, aggression, frustration will lead to aggression unless, right? And Smedslund to the point of bringing in hundreds of axioms and corollaries, for example. Not being shy to embrace that complexity and to reason about it. Grace?
Yeah, so continuing with the embracing complexity of behavior of persons, just going back and drilling in that point of how complex this can get. And as much as we try to kind of not isolate, but separate person-oriented psychology in its own right and to create this community and society, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done, because, as I said, like across the board, there are a lot of variations. And as much as we need new ideas and theories approaching, we still need a consistency. We need to start with a foundation somewhere, because I still find through this work and through presenting how there are a few other types of person-oriented psychologies, we need to be honing it in just a little bit more to get that foundation.
And final point, the other thing that the folks that we've run across is that there's I think an appropriate commitment to spelling out one's philosophical underpinnings before engaging in the work as well, which is something that also is not common in psychologies that are occurring at the population level, although they think they're at the person level, so-called mainstream psychology. So those are the points of contact that we see. How are we doing for time, Jane?
So there's 21 minutes remaining,
Excellent.
so you can use them any way you'd like. If we do a discussion,
Well,
then I can.
sure, yeah, well, I'm kind of tired of hearing myself talk. And if I'm tired of it.
Well, you've raised so much. Why don't we?
Yeah, what I'm hoping is that this has provoked other people to ask us questions, but also give their own thoughts, tell us about other person-oriented psychology that they've stumbled across. And maybe
take that down?
please, yeah, so then we can see Grace, because poor Grace has been invisible.
Oh, we don't need to see this face. We're all good.
Wynn's got his hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Be ready to do that.
Hi. For the last 4 years, I spend 2 or 3 hours I've spent 2 or 3 hours every month with Michael, with Kubovy, in a relationship that started because of and he's read a fair amount of Ossorio's work and this community's work, and he was Daniel Kahneman's first PhD student, one of his first PhD students, and he's a guy in his early 80s now who's probably the most significant Gestalt experimentalist, phenomenologist in the world, or amongst maybe 3 or 4 of them. As we're speaking, he's in Italy giving a talk about a book that he's creating with one of his friends and a philosopher on elucidation. our work together started by looking at the relationship between the notion of strands as how roles flow through a person's life with the concept of through lines, a notion of that we've had some issues with in this society, of ways in which to organize behavior in terms of how different implementations have a common significance over time as a way of looking at in character. So our work together spent a lot of time, at least in its initial form, at looking at this relationship between what is in character and how the roles themselves within the circumstances of life are performed. And from that, you know, the guy's one of my best friends now, and he's a very, very dear fellow. And you know, just there are a lot of people out there that can talk in ways that immediately recognize the way we talk, and ways in which
Right.
we immediately recognize
Yeah.
the way they talk.
Right. We'd love to have them come by for a talk sometime.
Great ones.
There you go, when you have an assignment for next week.
Yeah.
And I love to hear that, actually. I did spend quite a bit of time reading up on his work here, and it was my first introduction to strands. But it resonated so much with between person-oriented and descriptive psychology that I was quite surprised I hadn't heard of it previously. So it's great to know that it is really out there, and that he has a lot of connections with descriptive psychology, has read a lot of Ossorio and whatnot. So that feels lovely to actually.
He's been a sort of a major figure in statistical analysis and in the psychology of aesthetics.
Okay. Yeah.
He's a gestaltist. He's from that tradition, and
Wow.
which is, you know, he's a UVA.
Want to try to alternate between in person and online?
Sure. Yeah, that's probably
See if
good.
someone
Yeah.
in person has an
Yeah.
excellent, then a couple people hands up for online next.
So who,
I got the in person.
I'll just quickly say that I like person oriented.
Right.
It's a phrase that it's not off-putting at all.
Right.
And even a hard materialist could go, oh yeah, there's a place for person oriented psychology.
Well, yeah, cause
Not much of a place,
no,
but there's
well,
a place.
even Patty Churchland on her worst day might have to go ahead and admit that there are persons. Yeah. Yeah.
Medium-sized collections.
Yeah, and so to be clear, person oriented is not my term.
Exactly.
It's Lundh and Bergman, and I've had some contact with them, although they are older now, both retired. One's experiencing some ill health. I think Wynn actually had contact with one of them at one point. And so they have had, I'm not sure which, a journal called the Journal for Person-Oriented Psychology that they ran out of Lund, Sweden. It's different spelling, Lund, Sweden, out of the psychology department there, and some fascinating articles in there. And that's actually where we got the article on the 3 levels as well. So yeah, I think it's a great way of thinking about what we do and what others like us do as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Errol.
So Aaron, yeah.
So great talk. I was gonna mention just from my recent experience working in outpatient community-based clinic, that one thing that we do is utilize kind of person-centered language, and as a way of kind of keeping people person-oriented in their thinking, but not necessarily in an exhaustive way. Not necessarily going in and trying to kind of map out the entire set of terms related to what we mean by a person, but rather just kind of like getting into habits of how we phrase things. So kind of saying, you know, a person with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, or a person who's in, you know, early recovery. So in that kind of a way, I think there's a distinction to be made between what you're describing as person-oriented and sort of person-centered modalities and language. But one other example that occurred to me just in that sense is harm reduction models of treating sort of high-risk populations who are dealing with substance use. But it becomes like, even as I'm saying this, I'm just noticing like it becomes sort of like the thing that you focus on first is that there's a person involved. And I think in that ordinary kind of a way, it's something that people can pick up on quite naturally. And I'm just wondering, in that sense, do you find that an exhaustive understanding of what a person is has a direct impact on outcomes in, in treatment, or is it, or would you say it's something a little bit more commonplace, like sort of where you place the term, or in terms of the research that you've looked at, have there been any sort of notable differences, between one particular treatment modality or another? Maybe that's a little bit of a too pointed of a question. What's been your experience in terms of looking at some of these person-oriented versus person-centered treatment, and how do you distinguish the terms?
Oh, I'd have to think about that, Errol. I don't have a good answer for you right now. I think, yeah, Grace.
My first kind of, and this isn't going to be as detailed as probably you're looking for, but I find, okay, with all of the work that we're looking at, each person does have a slightly different definition of a person, of what a person is. But because it is more theoretical, more philosophical in getting those underpinnings, there's less of a focus on how it would play out in patient care and how we would actually use that language. We are focusing more on like the foundational structure, as I said. It is super interesting though, hearing the reality of it, and that what you have had in your experience. And although we are presenting kind of those structures here, there is definitely more to be said for how it is used in the language, and person oriented versus person like focused. So Ian, I would love to hear what you have to say, but unfortunately, I haven't.
Yeah. So my only thought is that so I'm not a clinician, but I think when people who are engaged in treatment are using the term person-centered, that to me, yes, it's a person-oriented move, but I think it's more specifically a move that is morally or ethically motivated, right? Because you don't want to say a schizophrenic, a depressive. You want to say a person with this and focus on it. Is that what you're getting at, Errol?
No, that's a great point, Ian. Thank you for making that distinction. That's actually sort of just the sort of feedback I'm curious about, because when you mention it, it does sort of bring up some of the reasons that are given for it, which is to combat stigma and to ensure treatment of the full set of needs, as opposed to just the one identified diagnosis. So that actually sort of hits the nail on the head that you mentioned, that it's sort of the differences, the motivation in terms of what you're aiming for. So yeah, that's great.
Do we have someone in the room? Joe?
I was intrigued by what you're doing is pointing out points of contact or similarities, or I don't know what quite word there.
Right.
And I was thinking about strands, and I wanted to offer a redescription or an elaboration of exactly what the relationship is between descriptive and strand thinking. And I begin with the fact that a person ordinarily and every day, it's a standard normal person, has a status or more than one status in several different communities. And the example of the woman who is the lawyer and a mother and a tennis player and so forth is a perfect example of that. There's nothing that needs explanation there. That's just how human life is, at least in modern life. And acting as a status in one community, a person engages in one or more social practices, which of course take time. And they engage in a version of the practices of the practice that reflects their personal characteristics, their values, their attitudes, their traits, and so forth. And then after some time, and that's going to vary from person to person, they act on a different status. The woman goes home and plays with her kids, for example. And then she goes and plays tennis with her friends. She's acting on a different status. In each case, she's enacting her status by different statuses, by engaging in social practices in versions of them that reflect her personal characteristics.
Right.
Now, we could take that complicated state of affairs and we could redescribe those similarities in how Jane engages in those practices and say, gee, that everything she does reflects various personal characteristics of hers, the way she engages in those practices. And then we could redescribe those similarities over time with an object metaphor, namely a strand. And but I would say to, I haven't got the right name here, who is the person who did this? There is nothing, but I would say to him, were he here, there's nothing to prove there. You don't need to look at anybody's brain to find out that as you go along in your life, you act as a status one in one community, status two in another community, in ways that reflect your characteristic, your personal characteristics. And your brain does whatever it does to provide for you doing those things in those ways. But there's no proving to be done here. It's an observed fact.
Well, that's interesting. So maybe
He doesn't have to prove it as possible.
Well,
It's right in front of
it's
you.
right in front of you. So I don't know enough about his work, and maybe Grace can speak to this in a second about whether or not he actually is being to prove anything.
No, he doesn't.
No. And the other thing, and this is something that that I know that Grace and I talked about, but maybe it wasn't as featured in the presentation as we might have planned, which is, and when Wynn talked about Kubovy being a Gestalt psychologist, I was reminded that one of Kubovy's points is that we shouldn't be atomistic about thinking about the strands and the statuses. That there's something about a particular set of strands that that needs something in and of itself. Am I saying that right, Grace?
I think he's getting a way of life.
Maybe. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Grace, to that?
Yes, you kind of hit it right on the head there. Essentially, it's more of, he kind of redescribes what we already know. The way that you're saying it, it's quite obvious it is just life. He goes in to explain how, as much as it's life, we still need a structure to describe it and something, again, to have consistency across the board. So we are all looking at it through the same perspective, because as much as it is, oh, well, we each have different statuses and whatnot, how are we talking about this? How are we doing research methods around it? We need to have some more consistency within that, instead of just saying, well, it's life. They have multiple statuses. We all know that. We all know A plus B equals C. We just need to make it a little bit more clear for everyone.
Just as a side, the strands have.
I see a lot of hands up, so I want to go to Walter next. We only have about 6 minutes left.
The strands issue strikes me as a lot more narrow and particular than the general concept of person-centered psychologies. That's just one comment. The other comment is that if for those who are interested or capable of writing articles or books, an article that addressed person psychologies, what's this about, and that articulated, that presented various approaches to this, among which descriptive psychology would be presented, could be a nice way of introducing ourselves better to the community at large. That's all.
That's an interesting point. I'll think about that.
Like a bit more digestible. There's a lot more factors to it that I feel like are relatable to other areas of psychology. And mainly because of the thing we go back to of that person psychology and person-oriented psychology is psychology. No matter if we're looking at population mechanism, it comes down to the person, and that's something that we all value. So I definitely agree that it is a little bit more of a digestible way to perhaps introduce us to other areas of psychology and get the word out.
We have someone in the room. And otherwise, let's go to Marty. I think he had his hand up.
You're on mute.
Marty,
You're
you're still
muted.
muted.
Yes, I'm just a shy, self-effacing person. I like to mime. That's one of my things. I missed a piece of the last discussion, but it just strikes me that, and I just wrote down the sentence here, but because DP has so much in common with I mean, with all good therapies, and so it's so ironic that there's this sense of we're isolated, we can't connect, we can't reach out, not reach out, but we somehow we are isolated and not people are not drawn to us, or we're not integrated and all of that. So engaging with a person in all their complexities with agency, the person has agency and is engaging in life, engaging with that person and all their complexity, that agent, is what all good therapy does. That's what therapy is, engaging with that complex person who has agency in life. Walking that journey, being with them, is what all good therapy does. I was drawn to DP. I was looking for CE credits for my license. I went to the conference in 2017 and I thought, these people are terrific therapists. The way they're talking about people, the talking about the processes, the complexities. I love this stuff. I love this community. I'm not an Ossorio acolyte, but I am a therapist who engages with people, and I worked with people, supervised people, taught whatever. So there's so much overlap. It's not the community, you are integral in the therapy community and vice versa. So it's puzzling to see the sense of isolation and what's going on. So that would be a very interesting thing to talk about, how to connect with the broad therapy community, because you are a shining example of it. So that's all I have to say.
Right, well, so I'm trying to do, and Martin and I and some others are trying to do the academic side. Well, I guess Martin both sides. But yeah, we probably need some more help on the therapy side, on the clinician side, to do that, I guess, because it is surprising. One of the goals of the talk was to hopefully bring a lot, bring some good news to folks in the society, that there are other folks out there who are doing this kind of work, who are deep thinkers, passionate about research, and who want to continue to do and promote work that is truly person oriented.
There's an appetite out there.
There is an appetite out there. In fact, I would argue that before an undergraduate walks into an intro psychology class for the first time, this is exactly the kind of thing that they want to know about. And then it's exactly the kind of thing that they're not told about.
Yeah. And kind of just to go on that, I resonated with that so hard what you said, Martin, actually, and being very new to this society, that is exactly what pulled me into this. And in school, when I started to learn about it through Ian here, that's what pulled me in, was this idea of psychology is so vast and large, but at the end of the day, all of this research only matters for how we implement it, how it affects the people that are coming in. It's through treatment, in my personal opinion. So to have a whole society that is just so focused on persons and this descriptive psychology which helps it. That really pulled me in, and it seems like the easiest way to have this stuff translated to real life, to reality, to our practices is through descriptive psychology. So I completely agree.
Thank you. Wonderful conclusion. Thank you, Peter. Wonderful. Let's take 9 minutes and then come back for our last presentation.